Okay, well, thank you, Nick. Thank you very much for inviting me once again. I hope hope my talk won't be too abstract. I'll say something about that in a minute. It's certainly meant to be introductory. I did say to Nick, this is an introductory talk. When I gave the talk on Kant and free will, at least 2 years ago now it was obvious a number of people were pretty okay with the issue. And perhaps that talk was able to some extent to deal with that. I mean, we can take the discussion on. But this really is an introductory talk. So those of you who know something about personal identity will excuse me, I hope. Okay, well, as Nick was saying, we're going to talk about the historical background first, and have a short discussion about that, and then we'll go on to some contemporary discussions of personal identity. So the historical background first, we're going to look at two well-known theories, one by Locke, John Locke, and the other by a couple of philosophers you may not have heard of in the 18th century, Butler and Reid. Okay, so let's see if this is going to work. The board, no, it's not working. Can we have the next slide? Good, thank you. I think that was you, Robin, was it, rather than me? Yeah, fine. But before we do look at those boys, let's ask ourselves, well, what is the central problem of personal identity in Western philosophy? There are various ways of putting it, but the ones we've got on the board there are as good as any, I hope. It is what makes it true that a person existing at one time, say last year, is the same person as a person existing at another time, say now. What it isn't a question is how do we come to discover that somebody existing now is the same person as somebody who existed 2 years ago, whatever. It's what makes it true, what constitutes the identity of a person at two different times. It makes them one and the same person. Now, one thing I would just like to say before I go on, because I've given a talk on personal identity once or twice over the years. From what I've just said, I think it's clear that the philosophical problem of personal identity is not a kind of a priori psychological investigation. It is not, for instance, an attempt to delve into the particular contents of a given person's personality traits in order to understand why they are as they are and how in detail the person's behavior might be affected consciously or unconsciously by these personality traits and their background. So if you come to this talk hoping to learn more about the intricacies of your personality and any unconscious forces, I'm afraid you're going to be very disappointed, because I'm not going to be talking about that at all. Sorry. That's not the philosophical problem. As I said, the main philosophical problem is what makes it true that a person existing at one time is the same person as the person existing at another time. Don't mean to suggest that philosophers aren't interested in personality traits, not in the way in which a psychiatrist or psychologist, etc., would be interested. Okay, so next slide, please. John Locke was famous 18th century, 17th century philosopher, founder of British empiricism, you probably know, and he wrote a famous book called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in the final edition of that, 1792, I think, 1794, sorry, he added a chapter on personal identity. It was called Of Identity and Diversity, but it did mainly deal with the problem of personal identity. That was the first concentrated work chapter specifically on personal identity. Not, of course, in the modern period that has come through to us. But it's not to say there weren't other great philosophers who were interested in personal identity. Descartes is an obvious example, but his view about the identity of a person kind of emerges from his great work, The Meditations, and from replies and objections that were, well, objections and replies that were thrown at him but he didn't actually write a continuous work on personal identity. Locke was the first person who did, and I'll try to sketch the fundamental of Locke's theory and how it differs from Descartes. Okay, there's a rather a nice drawing of John Locke with his dates there. I don't know if any of you were lucky to go to, is it Houghton Hall, Robert Walpole's country house in Norfolk about 4 or 5 years ago, where the Hermitage Museum, Robert Walpole sold his collection. No, he didn't. I'm sorry. I think it was his son or his nephew, not him. Sold his considerable works of painting, including Velasquez. But among them, there was a painting by Gottfried Kneller, which is probably the best portrait of John Locke. And it came back 4 or 5 years ago to Houghton Hall. It was hung with all the other ones which belong now to the Hermitage, because about that time somebody opened a drawer in Houghton Hall and found how they had originally been hung. And the Hermitage very kindly lent all those works for about 6 months. And you could go to Houghton Hall and see how Walpole had originally hung those paintings. Among them was this famous picture, not that one, that's not the one I'm talking about. The most famous picture of Locke is in the Hermitage by Geoffrey Kneller. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what is his position? What, according to Locke, constitutes personal identity? Well, what constitutes it for him is sameness of consciousness is what makes personal identity. That's almost a quote. For Locke, personal identity depends on what he calls sameness of consciousness. Well, what is that? Well, what Locke means by sameness of consciousness, as if, but only if, a person existing at one time can join by memory his present consciousness of what he is now doing with a past consciousness of having done something, this makes him the same person who performed both the past and present acts. I'll give an example. No, sorry, it's not working. Next slide, please. I'll read this one out because I think it's clear enough. I'm now aware of talking in a lecture, talk to you. I'm also now aware, by means of memory, of having drunk some tea in my hotel earlier today, and of having spoken at a conference in India 2 years ago. Since by using memory, I can now join these 3 different acts of consciousness, I mean, my present act of consciousness, not by memory, but my present act of consciousness, and by memory, these other 2 that I drank some tea in my hotel this morning, and that I gave a lecture, attended a conference and spoke in India 2 years ago, that because I can do this, I can bring them together, these 3 acts, into the thought that I am conscious of all 3 acts. And it's this sameness of consciousness that makes me one and the same person or self who has performed these 3 acts. That's what constitutes my being. The same person who's speaking to you now, had a cup of tea this morning, and spoke in a lecture in India 2 years ago. Next slide, please. Now, he also adds that if I cannot now join by means of memory these other acts, these 2 past acts, to my present one, then I am not the same person. He adds, I cannot now remember drinking a cup of tea earlier today or speaking in India 2 years ago, then I, the person now talking in this lecture, am not the same person who performed those earlier acts. Okay, next slide, please. In taking up this position, Locke is distinguishing himself from the great French philosopher René Descartes. He differs from Descartes' view in a number of ways. First of all, according to Descartes, Your personal identity, my personal identity, depends on the continuous existence of a substance, the soul or mind, which continues to exist through a given period. You exist over that period to the extent to which this substance, soul or mind, continues to exist. So on Descartes' view, different acts of consciousness belong to the same person if and only if all these acts of consciousness belong to or are grounded in one and the same substance. Now, there are two important differences between Descartes' view and Locke's. First, Locke allowed that the entity which sustains our consciousness can be either spiritual, a mind or soul, or material, for instance, the brain. He doesn't actually say the brain. He does think it could be a material substance, and that's the brain. He thought it was correct. So that's the first thing. The entity which sustains consciousness at any one time may be either immaterial, soul or mind, or material. And secondly, unlike Descartes, he says that the substance, whether it's material or immaterial, can change over time. It doesn't need to remain the same substance throughout a period where you continue, or anybody continues, a person continues to exist. Okay, next slide, please. Well, what was the point of Locke's account? It doesn't actually emerge till near the end of this chapter of identity and diversity. It's mainly because he's interested in the proper subject of praise and blame, responsibility for actions and so on. He calls this subject a person and claims that the identity of a person over time resides not, as Descartes had said, in sameness of spiritual substance, soul, or indeed a material substance, the sameness of the material substance, but wholly in the existence of sameness of consciousness. And it doesn't have to be the same material substance or spiritual substance, because it can change over time, right? What is required is only sameness of consciousness, as I explained it earlier. For Locke, it does not matter if this sameness of consciousness is made possible by one or many substances over time, and it does not matter whether these substances are spiritual or material. Next slide, please. There's a quote from Locke. Locke sums up together with a direct quote from him, and I'll read this out. Self or person is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, mind or brain, simple or compounded. Simple means can't be broken up, or made up of parts which could be broken up. It matters not. And it is the same self as far as that consciousness extends. That with which the consciousness of the present thinking thing can join itself by means of memory makes the same person and is one self with it and with nothing else, and so attributes to itself, and this is a bit about praise and blame, punishment and reward, and so attributes to itself and owns all the actions of that thing as its own, so far as that consciousness reaches. Consciousness by means of memory, bringing together past conscious acts with the present one to the thought that I did both those acts. Then you are one and the same person. Next slide, please. Okay, well, before we come on to Reid and Butler, pretty good theory, as I would say. Well, you know, this silly old fool, proggy fool, Descartes, all this nonsense about substance being the same. Be off with it. Let's just have sameness of consciousness. That's all required. And we don't even require one and the same substance to it. That's the stuff. Good British common sense as against metaphysical twaddle from France. Certainly when you first hear this view. I remember as a student being told about it. Good show, good show. Well, quite soon after Locke wrote this, in the case of Butler, not so Thomas Reid, two 18th century philosophers, Bishop Butler, Bishop of Durham, and Thomas Reid, who was first the professor of philosophy at Aberdeen and then at Glasgow, launched a counterattack against Locke. And that's what we're now going to look at. They make three very strong criticisms of Locke's account. Let's look at them. Okay, next slide. Okay, now Butler's first criticism. It's slightly long-winded, but I can explain it pretty easily in a moment. This is a very famous criticism. Butler said this. He made one of the strongest criticisms of any theory of personal identity, not just Locke's, that depends in some way on memory. We've seen that Locke's very much does. While Butler accepted that we may discover we are identical to some person in the past by using memory, he denied that memory or sameness of consciousness makes us, and that's Locke's own word, makes us or constitutes us identical to some person in the past. Butler argued, look here, in order for a person to remember having done something in the past, which is necessary to have sameness of consciousness, that person must already be the same person as the person who did the past action. My ability to discover by using memory that I did something in the past by memory depends on my independently being identical to the person who did the past act. It's absurd to suggest that memory makes personal identity, because your memory can only bring something back which is already yours. So it's ridiculous to try to define personal identity in terms of memory. Next slide, please. Butler completely reverses Locke's memory theory. Butler completely reversed Locke's theory. It is absurd, argues Butler, to claim that sameness of consciousness makes personal identity, since it is only possible to remember having done some action in the past if it is independently true that you are the person who performed that past action. So claims Butler, your personal identity must depend on something other than memory or sameness of consciousness. He said, look, it's absurd as to suppose that knowledge constitutes the existence of something. Let me show you. Look, by using my sight, I know that there is a chair in front, but that doesn't make it true that there is a chair in front of me. Independently, there needs to be a chair in front of me in order for me to see and therefore to know that there is a chair in front of me. And Butler said, look, you can't possibly define personal identity in terms of memory, because in order to use memory as discovery, you must independently be the same person. That's a very famous criticism. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, the brave officer paradox. This was put forward by Thomas Reid, you see, quite a long time later. Now, it's a law of logic, simple logic, that if A is identical with B and B is identical with C, then A is identical with C. Nothing difficult about that, okay. But if you add that to Locke's account, you get yourself into serious trouble. Now, I should have got this ready. Would these three, are you able to stand? You three, come forward and set up come in a row here. That's fine. Raise these up. Okay. Now, you are a 14-year-old. You are a 14-year-old boy who stole some apples. You are a young officer who captured a standard in your first campaign, and you are a general. Okay, so we've got young man, young officer, young or 14-year-old boy, sorry, boy, young officer, general. Now, the young officer can remember stealing the apples of the boy. The general can remember capturing the Standard in his first campaign. But, as Reid said, it's quite possible, he's completely lost, the general, any recollection of having stolen the apples, as a boy. Okay? Now, put that together with the law of logic. If A is identical with B, B is identical with C, then A is identical with C. Locke's theory is a no-no. It's a no-no. Why? Well, because the general, because he remembers capturing the Standard, is identical with the officer. General is identical with the officer. The officer can remember stealing the apples of the young boy. So the officer is identical with the young boy. But the general doesn't have any memory of stealing the apples. So on Locke's theory, there isn't sameness of consciousness between the general and the young boy. So on Locke's theory, the general is not identical with the boy who stole the apples. But that's absurd, because the general is identical with the officer, and the officer is identical with the boy, and therefore the general must be identical with the boy. So Locke's theory, and given logic, you get a contradiction. The general both is and is not identical with the boy. So, but he doesn't remember. Why? Well, people do lose their memory. I'm perfectly correct. Right, they do lose their memory. I mean, well, he couldn't remember. We're taking a case, but he doesn't. It's an incredible story. Could have done. Yes, and then that paradox for that general wouldn't arise. But people do forget things, of course, and therefore, on Locke's theory, the general both is and is not identical with the boy. Fine, thank you very much indeed. So that's the second theory. Sorry, not the second theory. Thank you. That's the second point. Okay, next one, please. Next slide, please. Okay, Butler and Reid both make. So the first one was Butler due to Butler, the second due to Reid. Reid says he entirely agrees with Butler's first argument, but Butler had already died by the time Reid was writing. And then they both make, although Reid makes it rather clearer, a moral objection to Locke's account. And it's this, and it's easy to show by taking a contemporary example. So I'll read this out, contemporary example, but very similar to the one that they give. Suppose someone steals a car and drives dangerously with it. The driver kills 2 people by his dangerous driving and perhaps maims some others as well, and then crashes the car. As a result of injuring his head in the crash, the driver never has any recollection, any memory of driving dangerously or of killing and maiming people. No memory at all, completely lost. Otherwise, he's the same. No difference to him other than that. Again, a credible story. Since the driver has no memory of these acts, he is not, according to Locke, the same person who is responsible for driving dangerously or of killing 2 people, since there's no sameness of consciousness, and that's what makes him the same person. Since he has no recollection, he is not responsible. But that, the objection goes, is outrageous. You can't possibly be exculpated from a crime simply because you now have no memory. I mean, I think the point about this objection, you might say, well, that shows our Locke is right about our theory. Our theory of personal identity is just Polity. But I mean, I think the point is that no theory of personal identity, which has lasted over many centuries, could possibly have had this morally outrageous conclusion that Locke has got it wrong, that Locke can't possibly have understood what constitutes personal identity if his own theory has that absurd moral consequence. Next slide, please. Well, those are 3 devastating, as generally thought, devastating, not necessarily utterly devastating, so nothing can be done to get the theory going again, but clearly any theory that is going to use something like Locke's theory as part of their theory of identity, has got to answer those objections. And well, what do Locke and Butler put in its place? Well, they go back to Descartes, silly old Descartes. Well, not now, but Locke's theory is looking pretty silly. In fact, many people say, look at it, it looks like a dead duck. No, they say, oh, no, look, what makes personal identity depends on the continuous existence of one and the same spiritual substance, which must sustain all the various conscious states that a person has throughout his or her life. Now, they don't have quite as Descartes, but it's clearly very, very close to it. There are often differences which I'm not going to get into. So when someone said, I saw my neighbor last week, I heard the president on the radio yesterday, and I am thinking about philosophy right now, all these separate acts of consciousness are being referred to one continuous mental or spiritual substance, which is referred to as I. And next slide, please, is a very, very good quote from Reid to sum up their position rather than the alternative. Yeah, I think start over there. My personal identity, your personal identity, my personal identity implies the continued existence of that indivisible thing which I call myself or I. This self is something which thinks and deliberates and resolves and acts and suffers pains and pleasure. I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I'm not just a series of these things, as Locke is saying. I am something that thinks and acts and suffers. My thoughts and actions and feelings change every moment. They have no continued but a successive existence. But that self or I to which they belong is permanent. I mean, if I really do exist, there must be an I which continues to exist, which has these experiences, adding as Butler had, that the self or substance must be immaterial. Incidentally, I have actually made it immaterial by saying that is indivisible. If it's indivisible, it must be absolutely immaterial. So that exact return to the central position of Descartes. And silly old Locke is now kicked out into oblivion, apparently. Okay, next slide, please. So there's a summary of Butler and Reid's criticism. Can you leave that slide? Go on one more, please. Thank you. We'll go. I'll leave that other slide up on the board in a second. So I think there'll be no doubt, not just me saying this, this is general consensus, that Butler and Reid have made three strong criticisms of Locke's account of personal identity. These criticisms will have to be answered by any modern account of personal identity, contemporary account, I mean, that is going to defend something like Locke's account against it. Actually, we'll see in the second half of this talk, attempts have been made to do that, at least in one. Right, thank you, that's it. Good, there we are. So we've got to hang on to this notion from the beginning anyway. I think I might actually, although I will show a few of those slides, we've got to get on if I'm going to cover as much as I was hoping to. Few philosophers, the gist of what I've got up there is this: few philosophers today would accept that it is reasonable to believe in an immaterial subject of experiences. Locke and Butler, following Descartes, thought that this subject, this I, had to be immaterial. Somebody was raising that issue. Right? Few philosophers today would accept that. There was one chap called Richard Swinburne, who professor of philosophy of religion at Oxford for a very long time, still alive, who does still try to defend an immaterial substance view of personal identity, but there are very, very few now. Why? Well, the scientific evidence strongly suggests that all conscious states, including memories, are at least causally dependent on states of brain, your brain, my brain, and not in any way dependent on a separate and continuously existing spiritual or immaterial substance. Indeed, there is no positive evidence, most people would say, that such a substance even exists. Well, a well-known contemporary philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who you may have come across, he wrote a famous article when he was younger called What It's Like to Be a Bat, which got a lot of discussion on the mind-body issue. But more recently, Nagel has interested himself in personal identity, also actually related to the mind and body question. And he argues, so that's the first contemporary, he's alive now, I'm kicking. I remember him at Oxford when I was there, actually. Very live American philosopher in New York. He argues that our personal identity depends intrinsically on the continuous existence of our brain. So it's not a continuously existing immaterial substance that constitutes your identity. It's the continuous existence of that one thing that sustains your consciousness now, namely the brain, your brain, and to the extent to which that continues to exist, you continue to exist. The extent to which that is destroyed, that's the end of you. And that's a very simple way of putting Nagel's view. It's very well argued, but that's intrinsically what it comes to. And just go over that a little bit more slowly. First, Nagel agrees with Butler and Reid that what we understand by the identity of the self must include the continuous existence of that entity upon which all our conscious states depends. He agrees with Butler and Reid on that. We cannot think of ourselves as Locke held, as constituted by a mere series of experiences brought together in one act of memory. But second, Nagel accepts that the scientific evidence shows that this entity is a material substance, the brain. Hence, he concludes our identity, our continuous existence, depends on the continuous existence of our brain. And Nagel himself briefly summarizes his view as, I am my brain, you are your brain. In one moment, that's what you are, and the continuity of that same brain, you continue to exist. Could we have a next slide, please? And the next one, that's it. That's a picture there of Nagel. His book, The View from Nowhere, quite readable. Got an interesting chapter on free will too. It's in there that he argues for his position. I am my brain. As I said, it's much more carefully argued than that time. But I want to get on. In short, we could go to the next slide probably. Thank you. In short, your or my continued existence depends on the continued existence of numerically the same brain, the one you have now. All right, so on his view, our identity will not be conserved in the change of brain, even where there is a continuation of the very same type of conscious states, including memory claims, in the new brain. Such a change must constitute the destruction, the death of the original person. Next slide, please. So, however qualitative, the second bullet point, however qualitatively similar this new brain is to the original brain, this change must constitute the destruction of the original subjective experience, because that is the brain. The I refers to that which makes conscious states possible. What is that? It's the brain. So that if there was a change of substance, subject, change of brain, the original self, you or me, ceased to exist, and the creation of a different subject of self. Well, is that it then? That's it. All we need was the conceptual analysis by Butler and Reid that I am not a series of experiences, but I am that which thinks, acts, resolves, feels, and I continue to exist as long as that I exist. You then go to the scientists, and the scientists say, hey, well, that's the brain. No more fancy footwork by philosophers, just go to scientists, and the philosopher's out of a job. Okay, that's it. Okay. Well, perhaps not. Perhaps, that's right, that's Nagel's view, that's perhaps right. But Locke's view revives. Modern attempt has been made to revive it. Okay, I'm just on my place. Yes. Okay. The next slide, please. Right, now the chap called Derek Parfit revives a Lockean theory of personal identity. I don't know if any of your talks Derek Parfit has come up, has he? A bit, yeah, but probably not on personal identity. He may have done. No, he's interested in others, but he made himself famous, and his most famous stuff is on personal identity. And although he wrote a very famous article called Personal Identity before the book Reasons and Persons, if you look at part 3 of Reasons and Persons, that is his discussion of personal identity. Okay, and I'm now going to talk about his theory. But that looks problematic in what we've been saying, doesn't it? Shall we have the next slide, please? Thank you. You see, it might seem that Nagel's brain view has dealt a decisive blow against any Lockean style theory of personal identity, because he agrees with all the criticisms that are made by Butler and Reid, except that the I is immaterial, it's material. But in fact, what is known as the problem of duplication has more recently been used by opponents of a brain continuity view of personal identity. So Parfit can be seen as putting forward an alternative view by attacking Nagel's views. Chronologically, that's not quite true, actually, because Parfit's view came before Nagel's, but I'm going to introduce you to Parfit's view as a reaction to the brain view. It has been argued via this thing called the problem of duplication. It has been argued that duplication supports a revised form of Locke's theory of personal identity. Let's see. Next slide, please. Thank you. Brain transplants. Many would now accept that if the brain of a person A is transplanted from the rest of the body and placed into another human body from which the original brain has been removed, but the rest of the body is kept functioning, person A would continue to exist, though in a different body. So if poor Nick has his cranium inside of his head brain removed, and I have my brain put into his cranium, but his body has been kept functioning by miracle doctors, but not logically important, not miracle and logically important. Then I would think of myself as inhabiting, I wake up the next morning and I'm in Nick's body. I mean, that famous vice versa story where father and son wake up in the other one's body, a kind of modern version of this with kind of scientific accuracy with their brains were swapped over. But let's not do the swapping over. Let's just have poor Nick's brain has been destroyed, and my brain has been put into his head. So I am now in Nick's body. Most people would say that. Most people would say that. Imagine your brain being successfully transplanted into another brainless body. Wouldn't you want to say that you had changed bodies, that you have survived, but in another body? Certainly Nagel himself would want to say that, and so would Parfit. Okay, next slide, please. Now take a case which is slightly different. Not a whole brain transfer this time, not a whole brain transfer. Instead, a transfer of each of the two upper hemispheres of the brain into a different body. Our brains are divided into two, the upper part into two hemispheres. Now, in this case, we will take these two gentlemen here, Robin and Nick. Okay, and again, their two brains are removed and destroyed. Okay, and then take your brain, doesn't have to be mine this time. Half of your brain is put into Nick's body, and the other half is put into Robin's body. Now, although it's rare, it is the case that both hemispheres of the brain can hold the same character trait, the same memories, the same intentions, desires, future, etc. It's rare, but it does happen, and there is good evidence for that. So in this case, instead of the whole brain had gone into Nick's body, the I was in Nick's body. There's one person, Nick, sorry, not person, there's one body, Nick, who has all the memories, character traits, intentions about looking forward, what I'm thinking about for the future, etc. in Nick's body, and Robin has equally a person who has the same memory, makes the same memory claim, blue ones, has the same character traits, and the same intentions. Okay. Now, in the first case I took, where it was a whole transplant, my identity has been transferred to Nick's body. I am now in Nick's body. But in the case of a dual transfer, we can't say that, because two people are now claiming to be you. If you're imagine your two hemispheres of your brain. I'm doing my case, but you could take it in your case. Both the Nick person, Nick body person, I should say, the Nick body person and the Robin body person are both claiming to be Andrew Ward, all right? Because they have the same memories, character traits, etc. In the case of one, the whole brain went, you say that is Andrew Ward, but in Nick's body, vice versa story. But we can't say that in the case of two, because two people can't be identical with one person. One person can't be identical with two people. Okay. Yeah, I think each of these two persons have the same character, intentions, intellectual abilities as the one original person. Next slide, please. But two persons cannot both be identical with the unoriginal person. That's logically impossible. And it would obviously be illogical to say that only one of them is, since there is nothing to choose between them. Because, oh, well, Robin isn't Andrew Ward. Robin isn't, it's only Nick is. Because there's no difference between them. That would be illogical. But notice this. If only one of the upper hemispheres of the original person had been successfully transplanted, say, into Robin's body, and the doctors had dropped the other hemisphere and it had gone destroyed, etc., we would have no doubt, I'm giving you a perfect argument, but I think it's right, we would have no doubt that I had survived in Robin's body. If there had only been one hemisphere, then we would. But if there are two, we can't say I am identical with two people. Next slide. Yet it seems ridiculous to claim that where only one of the two hemispheres is successfully transplanted, I said, well, one is successfully transplanted and I dropped the other, then you can say, I have now moved over into Robin's body. But where both hemispheres are successfully transplanted, we can't call it identity. Yet it seems ridiculous to say that I have not survived, that I have died. As Parfit says, the famous quote from as the exponent of this argument has put it, how can a double success be a failure? If only one half of the brain had gone successfully transplanted and the other half been destroyed, we would have no problem in saying that I am now in Robin's body. If both halves are successfully transplanted, we can't say that I'm identical with two people. I can't be identical with two. But it's equally absurd, said Parfit, to say that I've died. How can a double success, namely a person who has all the memories, character traits, intentions in Robin's body, and similarly, in Robin's body, and another person in Nick's, we can't say those two are identical with the original. But it would be absurd to say that I, Andrew Ward, have died. So what consequence does Parfit draw from that? He draws this. The consequence that Parfit draws from these cases is that the duplication argument cannot be used to show that a Lockean style theory is ruled out as a theory of survival, even if the duplication argument does raise serious issues about our idea of the identity of a person. Because we're inclined to, I have survived in two bodies. There are two survivors of me. I can't say there are two people who are identical with me, but there are two survivors of me, says Parfit. Go on, next slide. Parfit's conclusion. Duplication, where we've got two hemispheres, one in Nick's body, one in the other body, Robin's body. Duplication shows that identity is not what is important in our thought about personal identity. All these years we thought what's really important about it is whether I'm identical with somebody in the past or future. That's not really important, says Parfit. That's not really important. What duplication shows is what is important is survival, whether singly, where it is identity, or double or triple. That doesn't matter. That's survival. That's what's really important. Survival, not identity. According to Parfit, duplication proves that what is important in personal identity is the continuation of our mental life, the continuation of our character, intellectual ability, intentions, and memories. And they have gone through. In the single case, where my whole brain went into Nick's body, what's important is the continuation of our character traits, memories, etc. That's what makes that's identical. In the case where it's two, we can't say I am identical with two future people, but we can say I survive as in two bodies. I do survive. Okay, and that shows that what's important about identity is the continuation of our mental life. But you will say, hold on, that's something, that is incredible, but it doesn't really quite do down the brain view, because even in the double case, there is the continuation of part of the brain all the way through. One half of my brain has continued into Robin's head, and the other half has continued into Nick. So there is still something underneath which is continuing to exist. Let's have the next slide, please. But Parfit wants to say, once you've gone down that way, you shouldn't stop there. Why not? Parfit claims that it does not even matter for your survival whether your mental life depends on one continuously existing material entity, the brain, or even half the brain, or on several successive material entities. Do you remember Locke said, it matters not whether it's material or immaterial, and it matters not whether it changes over time. Now, Parfit is going to say, it matters not whether you have the same brain or half the brain all the way through. Well, let's see why he says that. To illustrate this claim, Parfit considers the example of teletransportation. Next slide, please. Okay, teletransportation. This is Parfit style, not the American film. What is it? They use teletransportation. Star Wars, I think it is. Star Trek. Thank you, Star Trek. It's not the same story. This is a more complete version of teletransportation than Star Trek. Suppose scientists take a record of all the cells in your body, including all the cells in your brain. Your original body, including your brain, is then destroyed, wiped out. But this record of all the cells of your body is then electronically sent to Mars, where an exact replica body and brain, of course, given because they have this the record of the structure of your cells, is then made from wholly new material on Mars. That's the difference from Star Trek. Wholly new material from Mars is used to construct a replica body. The person on Mars would have the same character traits, make the same intentions, express the same intentions, have the same intellectual powers, as well as making the same memory claims as the original person on Earth. Because the brain structure is identical. The brain structure is identical. So all the mental equipment or ways in which a person expresses themselves will be there, person on Mars, just as they were of the person on Mars, on Earth, who's been destroyed. Okay, so that's teletransportation. Next slide. Thank you. But now in this case, there would not be one brain existing throughout. That first brain was destroyed, including the heart. Pick the Acid was put all over it. It's gone. We just had a record on paper, which was then sent to Mars. And out of a wholly new material, a brain was made, which is an exact replica, cell for cell, of your. But there would not be one brain existing throughout, or even half a brain existing throughout, since the person on Mars clearly has a numerically distinct brain to the person who already existed on Earth. It's made of wholly new material. Yet since, as Parfit claims, the mental life of the person originally on Earth, you or me, we've been destroyed. Our bodies, our bodies, I should say, our bodies have been destroyed. Is continuing on Mars. Why? Because we've got a continuation of the same mental life. Just as it would have continued mental life if the first brain was still functioning. We have all that is ordinarily required, according to Parfit, for personal identity. The only difference is that it's a replica brain, but all the mental life is the same as it would have been if you continued existing on Earth. This shows, argues Parfit, that one continuous material entity, the brain, or even half of it, is not required. A succession of distinct brains also preserves identity, provided the mental life continues. Next slide. Yes, we'll leave that slide. Go on, next one.
Okay. When can I go to the stand? Back. Yeah, okay.
Okay. So, sorry, yes. So Parfit's position is here now, I think you can see, a modern version of Locke's account. There's no continuous substance at all. Parfit's emphasis on the continuation of our mental life for survival, even if there is no spiritual substance, of course there isn't, Nagel didn't think that either, sustaining our mental life, and irrespective of whether there is one or many successive material entities that are sustaining consciousness over time, has much in common with Locke, because teletransportation, there are successive material entities sustaining consciousness. There's not one, successive. And that, of course, as Locke said, it matters not whether it's material or immaterial, it matters not whether it changes. What's Parfit come up with? He's come up with a theory which is very, very similar to Locke. It's known as the neo-Lockean theory. But there are notable differences between the two theories. One is this, that while Locke relies wholly on memory to secure personal identity, Parfit adds character and intentions and intellectual abilities, intelligent, whatever it is, as a means of securing personal identity. He doesn't just rely on memory, but similarity of character traits, similarity of intentions, and similarity of intellectual abilities over time. Next slide, please. And this surmounts some of the problems with Locke, including some that were made in at the end of the first talk. Good points were made in there, and then this surmounts problems for Locke. So in the earlier example of the reckless driver, who after killing two people loses forever any memory of driving dangerously when he crashes the car, can still be held to be the same person, provided his character, intentions, and intellectual capacities remain unaltered, or nearly so after the crash, because Parfit doesn't just rely on memory. So though the chap's memory is gone, character traits remain, intentions, the interests of the future, intellectual capacities remain, and that's surely enough to say, well, he may have forgotten that, but he's still the same person. So that gets over the moral problem. Moreover, Parfit gets over the gallant officer paradox, which we saw with the three of you up in the front, because Parfit allows that memory can be used to secure identity, even when the person, well, whether there is a memory, of course, when the person has only an indirect memory connection to some past action. And this avoids Reid's brave officer paradox, because all Parfit requires, unlike Locke, is that the general can remember capturing the standard as a young officer, and the young officer can remember stealing the apples as a boy. That gives an indirect connection between the general and the boy. Even though the general has no direct memory, there is an indirect connection via the young officer. And so the problem with that paradox disappears as well. Next slide, last slide, I think. Well, should we accept Parfit's theory? It's a Lockean theory, no question, I think, about that. Does Parfit's position simply overlook or dispense with the idea that there needs to be a single subject which underlies all the experiences which I call mind? The idea that the self or I refers to a continuously existing subject that sustains all the experiences that are ours can seem, and has seemed to many philosophers, compelling. Not all, by any means. If, like Parfit, you seek to reduce our personal identity to a mere series of experiences, it is arguable, according to some philosophers, that this is not just a revision of our normal idea of ourselves, because Parfit's view is clearly a revision, but amounts actually to the destruction of our personal identity, because there is no single I that continues to exist throughout the time where we think that somebody is identical. Some people say, well, that actually amounts to destruction. Whilst according to Parfit, Locke's account, revised, is the answer. Okay, that's it.